1281, Hakata Bay, northern Kyushu. One of the largest amphibious invasion forces the pre-modern world had ever seen is sitting in the water, going nowhere. Two fleets, one from Korea, one from southern China. Together they carried the full military weight of the Yuan dynasty, the empire of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, heir to the largest land empire the world had ever seen. They have fought the Japanese on the beaches. They have run into a wall, not a metaphor, a literal stone wall the Japanese built along Hakata Bay in the 7 years since the last invasion. They have lost men. The seas is moving through the ships that were never built to hold an army this long. The water is running low. They are not winning. Then, in late August, the sky changes. The storm that follows will be called Kamikaze by the Japanese who survive it, divine wind. It will destroy the fleet. It will end the invasion. It will end all serious Mongol ambitions toward Japan. Most accounts stop there. Storm arrives, Mongols defeated, Japan saved by the gods. Here is what those accounts get wrong. Japan was not saved by a typhoon. Japan was saved by the Japanese. The storm just finished the job. Konnichiwa, Benito desu. Jaku to Historian Channel e yokoso. Welcome to the Jack the Historian. I am Benito. Some of you know the story from The Ghost of Tsushima. If you ever played the famous video game, you have already walked part of this ground. Set in 1274, the first Mongol invasion of Japan. The setting is real. The shock of what the Mongols brought to the Japanese shores is real. The resistance is real as well. What the game could not show is what came next. 100,000 men ended up anchored in a Japanese bay in the middle of a typhoon season. The story begins about 15 years before the first arrow is released. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in history. Genghis Khan built it through military brilliance, extreme violence, and a talent for absorbing conquered people into his machine. Genghis Khan died in 1227. The cause is uncertain. Illness, a fall from a horse, the accounts do not agree. But the empire did not die with him. It kept growing. The throne passed to his son Ogedei, then down through the family. The conquests kept rolling. Persia, Russia, the edge of Europe. By the 1250s, the Mongols held a single unbroken empire from the Pacific almost to the Mediterranean. But an empire that size does not stay one thing for long. Within a generation, it had splintered into rival khanates. And the family had turned on itself. Kublai Khan, a grandson of Genghis, took the throne after a civil war against his own younger brother. He won. The prize was no longer the whole Mongol world. It was the eastern half of it. China, Mongolia, Korea. He still called himself Great Khan of all the Mongols. The Western Khanates were no longer listening. Kublai pushes further. He establishes the Yuan dynasty, capital at Kambalik, modern Beijing. By 1279, he finishes the southern Song, the last Chinese power capable of standing against him. The timing matters. The first invasion of Japan comes in 1274, just a few years after Kublai locks in the Yuan dynasty. The second in 1281, 2 years after the southern Song falls. The momentum of Mongol expansion, unbroken since Genghis, is pointing eastward. Japan is what is left. Korea, the kingdom of Goryeo, has been forced into Mongol vassalage after decades of devastating campaigns. This matters because Korea is the bridge to Japan. For the first invasion, it is the launching platform. The ships are built there, the army stages there. For the second invasion, Korea still provides one of the two fleets, while the other sails from southern China. Japan in this period does not run the way outsiders might expect. There is an emperor, but the emperor is ceremonial. Real power, the kind that makes actual decisions, belongs to the shogun. Think of the shogun as a military ruler who governs in the emperor's name. The institution built around him is the shogunate. Japan has worked this way since the 12th century. There is one more layer. By 1268, even the shogun is largely a figurehead. Real decisions are made by the regent, the shiken, the man behind the man. When the first Mongol letters reached Japanese authorities in 1268, the shiken is Hojo Tokimune. He is 17 years old. Keep that in mind. What did Kublai Khan actually really want? Kublai begins the diplomatic process in 1266. The first major letters reach Japan in 1268. He demands tribute and submission. The threat is unspoken. Armed conflict if Japan refuses, but nobody needs this spelled out. Anyone who knew what the Mongols had done elsewhere could fill in the blank. No continental ruler had ever treated Japan like this, as a lesser state expected to pay tribute and know its place. Japan had traded with China, borrowed its culture, kept up relations with Korea, but always at a distance from mainland power. The letters land with the weight of something genuinely new. They go to Kyoto, to the court, then on to Kamakura, to the military government. There is real disagreement between caution and a harder line. Tokimune, the regent, the shiken, says nothing. Whether that silence is deliberate strategy or a 17-year-old regent still finding his footing, the effect is the same. Kublai Khan is left waiting, without an answer, and for years. This happens again and again. Different envoys, different letters, the same silence. In 1271, a Mongol mission reaches Kyushu and is sent home empty-handed. More will follow in 1272 and 1273. Japan keeps not answering. After the first invasion, Kublai sends more envoys. In 1275, 5 of them are taken to Kamakura and executed at Tatsunokuchi. In 1279, another mission is executed at Hakata in northern Kyushu. Killing envoys is an extraordinary escalation, and Tokimune knows exactly what it says. These men die because he wants Kublai Khan to understand, beyond any possibility of confusion, that the answer is no. Not silence, not delay. No more talk. Just no. The Mongol tributary system is not the same as outright conquest. Plenty of people in the Mongol orbit keep their real autonomy. They paid tribute, bowed to the Mongol authority, sent troops when called, and otherwise ran their own affairs. What Kublai demands of Japan at first is that relationship. Acknowledge him, pay tribute, submit, in name and in practice. Whether he means to occupy Japan outright if it submits, we cannot say. What we can say is this. Japan's silence stops being a political problem and becomes a personal one. He has conquered China, the most powerful empire in East Asia. He has brought Korea to heel. He has thrown armies into Vietnam and Burma. The idea that a cluster of islands off his eastern coast will not answer his letters is an insult, and he cannot let it stand. There is a strategic case too. A compliant Japan secures his eastern flank and pushes Mongol power to the edge of the Pacific. Some historians point to other factors: piracy, trade routes, control of the East China Sea. Maybe, but the scale of 1281 is hard to justify on strategy alone. Japan is not China. The wealth to be taken does not come close to the cost. At some point, the logic stops looking for geopolitical and starts looking like a man who is not used to hearing no. But what was the plan? What did they intend to do? In 1274, during the first invasion, the plan is built on Korea. Korean shipwrights built the fleet. The invasion launches from Korean ports. A large part of the force is Korean. Men fighting out not out of loyalty to Kublai's ambition, but because their kingdom is his vassal, and refusal is not an option. Hold on to that. From the very beginning, a great many of the men sent to conquer Japan have no particular reason to want to. The force probably numbers 30 to 40,000 on several hundred ships. The exact figures are disputed, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. The plan itself is simple. Cross the strait, take the islands of Tsushima and Iki, which guard the approach to northern Kyushu, land at Hakata Bay, beat whatever the Japanese put in front of you, push inland and force a settlement. The island of Tsushima falls fast. The island is defended by the So clan under the leader So Sukekuni, who fights and dies there. They're badly outnumbered and they know it. They fight anyway. Iki goes the same way. By the time the fleet reaches Hakata Bay, the defenders on the mainland know exactly what happened out there. They have no illusions about what losing means. The landing at Hakata Bay is where the plan starts to come apart. A Kamakura warrior fought to be seen. He announced his name, his lineage. He sought out a worthy opponent. He needed witnesses to what he did, because that is how reward worked. You proved you had taken down a worthy warrior and the government paid you for it. Against an enemy who also fought as individuals, the system functioned. Against the Yuan army, coordinated formations, massed archery, noise weapons, gunpowder, it did not. The samurai who rode out to find a worthy opponent found something his entire culture had not prepared him for. The Japanese give ground, not a rout. They fight continuously all day, but they're pushed back steadily until by evening they fall back toward Dazaifu, the old administrative center inland. The seawall they built in response turns an open beach into a fixed line. On a fixed line, the Japanese can fight on their own terms. The whole plan rests on one assumption, that the Japanese will fold like everyone else. This did not happen. After 1274, Kublai planned something on a different scale entirely. Two forces launching from two places. The Eastern Route Army sails from Korea, Mongols, Chinese, Koreans. The Southern Route Army, sometimes called the Jiangnan Army, sails from southern China, made up largely of former Song soldiers, men who had been fighting the Mongols until a couple of years earlier, now pressed into a Mongol war they have no reason to believe in. Traditional accounts put the combined force of the second invasion at around 140,000 men. The number is debated. What matters is the shape of it. A two-fleet invasion on a scale Japan had never seen, and a plan that depends entirely on those two fleets arriving together. That is the hinge the whole plan turns on. It is also the first thing to break. But there is an intelligence failure, what they did not know or chose to ignore. The intelligence failure of 1274 is as basic as they come. The Yuan commanders do not understand the enemy. The samurai are not men you can frighten into giving up quickly. They're warrior elites with deep roots, fighting on their own ground, men whose status, land, and family honor are bound up entirely in military service. they're not going to break at the first shock. Japanese account of that first encounter with Yuan tactics read like genuine disorientation. Fighting in mass formation instead of single combat, noise weapons to panic the horses, projectiles some sources describe as explosive or incendiary. There is one samurai who left a painted record. His name was Takezaki Suenaga. He fought in both invasions and later commissioned the Moko Shurai Ekotoba, a set of scrolls showing what he saw. They document things the Japanese had never encountered before, but they come with a warning label. Suenaga had them made to glorify his own role and back his claim for reward. They were copied and altered over the centuries. Some famous details, including a well-known image of an exploding shell, may have been added much later, so we use them carefully. Written accounts and archaeological finds confirm gunpowder weapons were present, but we do not hang the whole case on one painted image. What the sources also show is a Japanese force that adapts. The first shock does not break them. They give ground, regroup, keep fighting. Whatever edge the Yuan have in the opening hours, it does not produce the quick collapse they were counting on. For 1281, the failure is worse, because they had 7 years to study the problem and they did not solve it. The most important thing that changes in those 7 years is the coastline. The Japanese built a stone wall along Hakata Bay, roughly 20 kilometers long, up to 2.8 meters high. The seaward face is straight and sheer, designed to stop a landing force. The landward face slopes, so mounted archers can ride up and fire down onto the beaches. The Yuan have no reliable intelligence. It exists. When the 1281 fleet arrives, the wall is there, and it works. As for the weather, the 1281 fleet keeps most of its men aboard ships for weeks, in the heart of typhoon season. Whether they understood that risk or were simply trapped there, the result is the same. A huge force sitting at anchor, burning through supplies, exposed to whatever the sky decides to do. But of course there is a command failure, the decision that made both invasions unrecoverable. In 1274, the first invasion ends in a way historians still argue about. The Yuan force lands at Hakata Bay, fights all day, pushes the Japanese back, and then that night it withdraws to the ships. Why? Nobody is certain. Japanese sources point to fierce counterattacks and worry about Japanese reinforcements inland. Some historians suggest standard doctrine, pull back to the ships rather than hold an exposed position overnight in enemy country. Others point to supply problems or losses among the senior officers. The honest answer is we do not have a Yuan or Korean source that explains the decision. This one, history has not settled. That night, a storm hits the fleet. How severe? We do not know. Whether it was technically a typhoon, the sources do not agree, but it does real damage, and the force pulls out. The command failure of 1274 is hard to pin down because the evidence is thin. Here is what we can say. A force that fought all day and pushed the defenders back left before holding any ground, went back to its ships, got hit by a storm and sailed away. In 1281, the situation is different. The command failures are easier to see. The Eastern Route Army arrives first. The Southern Route Army falls behind schedule. Rather than waiting at the rendezvous, the Eastern force goes ahead alone and attacks Tsushima and Iki. Once again, two fists were supposed to land together. Instead, one lands, then the other much later. When the combined force finally moves to Kyushu Island, it cannot land. The wall is there. The Japanese fire is effective, so the commanders make the fatal decision. They keep the army aboard the ships. Think about what that means. These are not vessels built to house an army for weeks. It is summer. They're packed far beyond comfortable capacity. Disease moves fast in those conditions. Dysentery, infected wounds, the ordinary killers of any army that sits still too long. The force is being ground down before the real fight even starts. Water is the worst of it. They cannot resupply from shore without running into Japanese fire. Parties sent for water get attacked, so the fleet sits there, thirsty, sick, hot, waiting. Though it is not entirely clear what for. And every night the Japanese come with small boats in the dark, raiding the anchored ships, killing men, setting fires, slipping away before dawn. None of it is decisive on its own. All of it together is a slow bleed. The core command failure is the refusal to either force a landing or pull out. Maybe it was rational. The wall made a landing costly. Maybe it was paralysis. Two huge forces under separate commands unable to agree. Either way, the result is the same. An army destroying itself by attrition before the weather even arrives. When the typhoon comes in late August, it does not hit a fresh army. It hits an exhausted, sick, half-starved one. It finds a fleet the Japanese have already been beating for weeks. What did the Japanese do right? Most accounts of these invasions spent all their time on why the Mongols lost and almost none of it on what the Japanese got right. That is bad history, and we're not doing that here. The Japanese defense of 1274 and 1281 was serious. Intelligent, adaptive work sustained across nearly 15 years. It deserves to be treated that way. Hojo Tokimune is at the center of it. As Shiken, he sits at the heart of the response. The diplomacy, the mobilization orders, the coastal defenses, the political work of holding the warrior government together. From age 17, when the first letters arrive, to his death in 1284, he is the organizing force behind Japan's survival. This was not a modern, centralized state with one man pulling every lever. Orders moved through the Bakufu, through Hojo family networks, through provincial military governors, the Kyushu warrior houses, the great shrines and temples. But Tokimune stood at the center of that web, and it is hard to imagine it holding together without him. Tokimune also practiced Rinzai Zen, under a Chinese master he had brought to Japan, a man who had himself fled the Mongol conquest of China. Rinzai is an intense branch of Buddhism. It uses riddles, koans, designed to break logical thinking and force sudden clarity. The practice demands total mental presence for a warrior culture that had obvious appeal. For Tokimune, the religious and the martial were not separate things. After the war, he founded a temple at Kamakura, Engaku-ji, dedicated to the dead of the invasion. And not only the Japanese dead, the Mongol dead too. The men who ordered enemy envoys beheaded also raised a monument to the souls of the enemy. In his world, that is not a contradiction. It is just who he was. He does not get the credit he deserves in Western accounts of these events. The 7 years between the invasions are not a pause. They're a sustained, expensive, exhausting national mobilization. The shogunate orders a continuous coastal watch on northern Kyushu. Warrior houses from across western Japan are assigned rotating duty, watching the sea for sails. Local clans are forced to patrol the beaches permanently. Land is reallocated to fund soldiers. Samurai in the region are banned from leaving Kyushu. It costs money. It costs years. The heaviest weight falls on the domains nearest the threat. The same Kyushu houses that will do most of the dying. The seawall is one of the most visible products of those 7 years. Beginning in 1276, the shogunate builds a stone wall along the Hakata Bay coastline. In 1281, the wall works exactly as intended. The Japanese also change how they fight. After 1274, the samurai who had ridden out to find single combat knew it had not worked. They adapted. They built a fleet of small, fast-riding boats and took the fight to the enemy at night, rowing out in darkness to board, harass, and burn Mongol ships at anchor. It took nerve, and it also worked. The temples and shrines were mobilized too, prayers, rituals, petitions for divine protection. The threat was framed in openly religious terms. An attack on Japan was an attack on the land of the gods. That framing did real political work. It gave the defense an urgency that rose above the interests of any one lord, and it laid the groundwork well before the storm ever came. For the story, Japan will later tell about why it survived. Which brings us back to Takezaki Suenaga. He was a minor samurai from the Higo province. No commander, no great name. At Hakata Bay in 1274, he charged the Yuan lines looking for the kind of visible deed that earned reward. His horse was killed under him. He was surrounded, nearly finished, and survived more or less by luck. And then he did something that tells you everything about how this society worked. He decided he had not been properly rewarded, so he made the long, expensive journey to Kamakura, a serious undertaking for a man of his rank, to petition the government in person, and it worked. He came away with recognition and a reward for his service. Years later, he commissioned the scrolls. They are, in the end, a legal document made by a man determined to get paid. That does not make them false. His account of the fighting is vivid, detailed, and holds up where we can test it. But we read it knowing why it exists, and the warriors in general. It is tempting to reach for the later legend, which resisted. The Kamakura samurai were not yet the fully codified figures of the Bushido tradition. They were professional warriors whose status, land, family, honor, and religious life were all tied to military service. They had every reason to fight and no acceptable reason to refuse. Now set them against the other side, Korean conscripts and former Song Chinese, pressed into a war they had no stake in. Most of them not Mongols at all. The actual Mongols were a minority in both fleets. The gap in motivation between the two sides was real, and it ran through the whole campaign. But what was the final reckoning? The immediate consequences for the Yuan are catastrophic. The fleet is largely destroyed. Most of it never makes it home. The traditional figures for the dead run into the tens of thousands. We treat those as estimates, because medieval chronicles exaggerate and there is no reliable modern count, but the scale is not in question. The storm was not the end of it. The men who washed ashore were not safe. Yuan soldiers stranded on the beaches or clinging to wrecks in the bay were hunted down. Many were killed where they were found. Others were taken prisoner, and not all prisoners were treated alike. The Mongol, Korean, and Northern Chinese captives could expect execution. The Southern Chinese, the former Song men, the ones with the least reason to be there, were more often spared and put to work. Even in the aftermath, the war's logic held. The man who had chosen this paid for it. The man who had been forced into it sometimes did not. Kublai's response is to plan a third invasion. He does not take the defeat as a sign that Japan is not worth the cost. Orders go out, but the third invasion never sails, blocked by his advisors, the cost of the second, competing wars, and his own declining health. He dies in 1294, the conquest of Japan permanently abandoned. No continental power would try anything like it against the Japanese home islands, again for centuries. Japan was not the only place this happened. In the same decades, Kublai launched seaborne campaigns against Vietnam, against Champa, against Java, and they failed too. In much the same way, forces that arrived, fought, and left without holding anything. This is not a Japan problem, it is a Yuan problem. The Mongol war machine built for the steppe and the open field was never as effective on water against an enemy fighting for its own ground as it was on land. Japan is the most dramatic example. It is not the only one. Modern archaeology has added something the chronicles could not. Divers working the floor of Hakata Bay have brought up ship timbers, weapons, anchors, the ordinary belongings of man. What the wreckage suggests is a fleet of uneven quality, including hulls that look like flat-bottomed river crafts, pressed into service as ocean-going ships. If that is right, it matters. A riverboat in a typhoon is not an ocean ship in a typhoon. A logistic chain already stretched to its limit may have put to sea in vessels that should have never been out there. For Japan, the meaning of all of this is more tangled than the legend admits. The word kamikaze, divine wind, enters the language as proof of something specific, that Japan is protected by the gods, that heaven itself steps in when the country's survival is at stake. That story was partly built. The temples and shrines that had spent years praying for deliverance read the storm as the answer to their prayers, and they had even every reason to say so loudly. The shogunate had its own reasons to agree. A victory granted by heaven is far more useful than a victory handed over by luck. But the men who actually fought knew what had happened at the wall. They held it. They had run the raids. They had watched the enemy fleet rot at anchor for weeks. When the storm came, they were not bystanders praying for a miracle. They were an army that had been winning a long grinding defensive fight and watched the weather finish an argument that was already settled. The legend and the reality describe the same storm. They are not the same thing. The legend had staying power almost 7 centuries later, with the country facing another enemy across the Pacific. The same word, kamikaze, was given to young men flying aircraft into American ships. From a typhoon in 1281 to a cockpit in 1944. One word, one idea carried across the entire history of a nation. That tells you how deep the mark of these invasions went. There is one more consequence, and most Western accounts miss it. The defense has been ruinously expensive, and the shogunate had promised its warriors rewards. But the reward system ran on captured land, and there was no captured land. They had won a defensive war. Nobody's territory had changed hands. Thousands of warriors had fought and bled, and there was nothing obvious to give them. That did not destroy the Kamakura shogunate by itself, but it poisoned the relationship between the warrior government and the man whose loyalty kept it standing. The resentment built. 50 years later, the second invasion, in 1333, the shogunate fell. Hojo Tokimune did not live to see any of it. He died in 1284, 3 years after the victory, still in his early 30s. He was barely 33. The man who ordered the envoys beheaded, drove the seawall through, organized the watch, and held the whole government together through 15 years of pressure that would have broken most men twice his age. History does not hand out its rewards fairly. One last thing, this storm was real. It came, it destroyed much of the fleet, it killed an enormous number of men. None of that is in question, and this is not an attempt to write the weather out of the story. But the storm came late to a campaign that was already lost. The wall had held, the defenders had held. The raids had bled the fleet for weeks. The seas had done the rest. The greatest invasion force of its age was beaten, sick and stranded before the first cloud appeared. So when you hear that a divine wind saved Japan, remember what the wind actually did. It did not win the war. It arrived at the end of one and put its name on a victory other people had already earned. A 17-year-old regent who would not bend, the engineers who built the wall, the warriors who held the beach and rode into the dark night after night. The wind got the credit. They did the work. That is the story of the Mongol invasion of Japan. Next time we go to the year 9 AD, to a forest in Germania, and to watch 3 Roman legions that march in and do not come out. Well, this is the end of our episode, and as the Japanese would say at the end of an episode, 最後まで聞いてくれてありがとうございます。So I will see you guys next time. Thank you for following up until the end. Bye.